Hello, my name is Joshua Leslie, and this is my final presentation for Text as Data. The question I asked for my final presentation was, how does the Times of India express its ideology on China and India's open border with Nepal? This question came to me through a long process. In fact, I had begun with the goal of trying to understand both China and India's media's landscape in relation to Nepal and how their media might be able to determine what public policy each government is trying in terms of Nepal. However, this was a Herculean task, and after attempting to scrape data from China, I realized the difficulty it was going to be. Essentially, I would have had to hand code and hand copy each document. I didn't have the time. So I choose to change my final project in terms of the Times of India, which I found to be the easiest possible scraping newspaper in English. And even when I say easy, I don't really mean easy. Only recently have I finished fully cleaning the data. It took a long time to clean the data because the way that the Times of India had programmed it in was to include a lot of advertisements and extraneous information that was unnecessary and would have and had nothing to do with the article. So I decided to do one newspaper well rather than many not very well or without a large corpus. And then the Times of India in relation to other English newspapers in Nepal, I was interested in the Indian perspective. Nepal also has a long relationship with India. Our politics is very intertwined. The newspaper also writes extensively on Nepal, India sports, entertainment, news, and politics. And then for me, also one of the most fascinating reasons was that it's considered to be Indian Prime Minister Modi's newspaper in English in which he communicates with the public. So it'd be interesting to see if we can see public policy emerge within the corpus of data that we have. So to undertake this task, I began doing some background research on understanding how media might influence public perception. So the first article I really read was a Chang and Knight article in 2011 on how media biases are used to influence populations. They basically state that media bias and the influence of media on voting in the context of newspaper endorsements exists, but the extent of this reliance really depends upon the degree and direction of any bias. So this helped me kind of better understand that I would have to create direction within bias to understand maybe how the media's perception of Nepal was being created within the Times of India. So the next article I read was a Dodson Jacobson Cade article, and it's basically that media coverage on issues demonstrates the policy issues important to a newspaper. It basically looked at Chile and its writings about climate change. And it found that more leftist newspapers had a higher tendency to write about climate change than rightist newspapers, showing that the media does, in some ways, enforce its own policy on voters. Sorry for that. Um, and then the next was just culture and communication in as a new form of international relations. And this was a Molana article, essentially book, but it was it went deep into the idea that how cultures organize and how communication is expressed to us is the way that policy of certain governments can be determined and decided upon. So again, this kind of made me feel comfortable in terms of looking this as a question in our text as data class. Then the next question is India and Nepal's relationship, because I'm really looking at how the Times of India is expressing its relationship or India's relationship with Nepal. And first, Nepal is a strategic buffer state between India and China. And that's why I look at the open border, because although it's a buffer state between India and China, it still has an open border. And this is why I wanted to focus the question on China and open border. What is the Times of India reporting, particularly on these topics? India fears for an unstable Nepal. The security imperatives of gangs, terrorism, smuggling, and fake currency running rampant across the border is is one of the major concerns of India, and they work very hard towards ensuring an open border, but at the same time making sure that that type of crime per se does not occur. Um, and the China question is, as China becomes a more e- global power, India will begin to lose its influence in Nepal as they both border the country. So that's why I felt China very important with the India question in terms of its perspective of Nepal through a newspaper, through the Times of India. So let me just talk a little bit about the corpus. The corpus is about 1,600 documents with 24,000 features. It encompasses about 2.5, 3 years from April 2016 to October 2018. I I procure this corpus by scraping the Times of India for documents using the search word Nepal, regardless whether it was a political article, entertainment article, news article. I just wanted to see how the Times of India, the largest Indian daily, was expressing its perspective on Nepal and what was it highlighting in terms of what the Indians would call their little brother. So to do that, I also collected metadata, and that was the date, the location published, the section, whether it's news, sports, entertainment, or China or no China. Essentially, hand coding whether the article referenced China or not to see if there was a difference between how Times of India reported on articles with relation to China and articles that did not relate to China. So first, I decided to look at the corpus as a whole. Look at the data, look at the words that were most popular. And from this word cloud that I was able to develop after ensuring we removed all the stop words and numbers and etc. from the data, was that four topics began to emerge in terms of just looking at the words and seeing some sort of relation around politics, crime, China, and cultural, religious, sports. Basically, the subjects and categories that the Times of India would place certain articles. The Chinese one, I mean, these are the top 50 words. So two out of the top 50 words directly refer to China, which is significant. And then crime, you can see how accused, arrested, border, held, that there's something happening here. And this made me more interested in looking at the data deeper because I wanted to understand exactly this relation between Nepal, China, India, and this open border that exists, and especially from the Indian perspective. So I did a sentiment analysis, and the sentiment analysis was first on all articles. And basically, overall, the Times of India is sending a positive message to its readers regarding Nepal. If you look at the corpus as a whole, and this surprised me slightly, but again, it didn't because India and Nepal have a long relationship, and you'd expect that the majority of articles, if you have a good relationship and a long relationship with a neighbor to be positive. So, but then I began looking at the individual categories of the articles and try to understand if there was any difference between how the Times of India was reporting on different articles based on metadata. And this is where it gets really interesting to me because news articles were more negative than sports entertainment articles and politics articles. And this confused me for a little bit because news articles are generally feel good stories and don't have anything to do with politics. A biker cycling 1,000 kilometers, solar panels being introduced into a village. But as I dug deeper into the articles in relation to news, I began to notice another category emerge, and that was that crime category I was talking before. And that is partially why the news articles are much more negative because the news articles have a crime element to it that talks about rape, murder, trafficking, an open border, terrorism, and these all have negative connotations to it. So sports entertainment is more feel good stories. And then politics articles, because of the relationship Nepal that India has to build with Nepal and its constant aggrandizing of Nepali leaders, the articles in the Times of India that are politically based are more positive. From my look at it and from digging deeper into the data and reading a few of these articles that were highlighted within the positive articles in the news. Now, in terms of China, this is where the articles got the most negative. And a lot of the articles in news were also in reference to China, because that was within its news section. And this demonstrates that the Times of India is expressing a negative viewpoint on China in relation to Nepal, and that this has to be somehow caused by their relationship. And this relationship is important in the sense that without trying to be negative towards perceived Chinese influence into Nepal, that there is a growing fear in India of the Chinese influence in Nepal. And as numerous other articles have written without using a sentiment analysis on TOI and have predicted, this has become true. And this shows through the Times of India's reporting on China in Nepal. Now, I did a sentiment analysis spatial distribution of the histograms because I was curious on exactly how much of a negative and positive sentiment there was in the total corpus. And from my analysis of this distribution, I've begun to notice that it's much more around the zero mark. And although it is slightly more positive in nature, the fact that it's very concentrated between negative 0.05 and 0.10 makes me a little wary of fully making analytical decisions based on a sentiment analysis. So again, these results show the that the Times of India is more likely to produce news articles that are positive in regards to Nepal. I mean, that's essentially what the spatial distribution tells us. Now I looked at topic models. Topic models help us better understand a given corpus by defining the model used through the creation of probabilistic framework for the term frequency occurrences in the document. Um, the documents are then understood within the context of proportions of topics within each document. And as you can see here, I chose an LDA with 20 topics as my final choice because a lot of the words were able to be categorized within the topics that I thought before. And when I had 4 or 6 or 7 or 10, that was almost too few. It didn't fit the data quite well in terms of building categories. It was words that didn't really make sense when put together to create a topic. And I did 40 or 60, but that seemed to overfit from from in my perception. So I picked 20. And here you can see I've marked how we can perceive what the topics are in the Times of India. And from this, China again in the orange is another real topic within the corpus. And then crime is another real topic within the corpus. And again, I associate the crime with the open border. A lot of commentators and articles I've read have commented on how an open border has created crime in India from Nepal, and a lot of Indian criminals go to Nepal in order to hide away. So again, these topics are really beginning to emerge and come out in terms of what I previously thought. And of course, politics is another topic that is very dominant within these topics. Then I did an STM analysis because I was unsure whether I had fit the LDA correctly, and also I, I picked 20 topics, but I didn't have any statistical basis in which to determine and think that the 20 topics were correct. So I used the STM as an enhancement more to the LDA model. It allowed for me to include covariates that I found interesting into the document topic and topic word distributions. Um, so so the covariate I added was China or no, yes or no. So using that as a covariate, it came out with 88 topics, which shocked me because I thought that might be overfitting. But again, I let the model do its magic and it came out with this. And rather than overfitting, what I saw, and I'm using the top 25 out of 88 topics as an example, was strong relationships between the words. And for me, that was exciting because it showed that we could quickly summarize this large corpus of data into topics that really mattered. And then by looking at those topics individually, try to come up with a larger story. And looking at the top 25, we can see again how China is an important part of the Times of India's reporting, how crime, especially border trafficking, police are again an important part of the topics in the Times of India, and then politics, Indian politics, especially Modi. Modi is referenced many times in this STM analysis. So just to show you an example of a few topics from the corpus. So topic 49, one on China that I felt, again, this is on Oli meeting Chinese leadership, trying to connect, and then crime about the open border, and then the fear of terrorism occurring. Then also the final one is political, and it's the interesting about this was SARC political, so I didn't realize that um, SARC being South Asian Regional Cooperative Association, all the South Asian countries. And I didn't realize that those articles had been included in the political. Then I looked at the metadata effect on topics, and this was the effect of China versus no China. And I picked three topics. And as you can see, that certain topics about China were were much more relevant to China. So like topics such as temple visit Modi, with those as being the topic words, they have they have very little relation to China, whereas Nepal Port China subtopic 81 has a high relation to China. And so again, um, this was just interesting in terms of mapping out where certain topics were based on China. And then to look at the open border and my thesis on does does India have a concern with the open border and in relation to China? Um, I did label prediction using a naive Bayes classifier, and essentially class I noticed a lot of news articles that were focused on the topic of crime. Um, as when I was looking through the articles, these seemed a little benevolent at first, but the more I looked into it, the more I began to realize that the Times of India was reporting Nepal in a way that seemed to be dangerous and an exporter of violence and gangs. So to understand better if my thesis was correct, and I labeled each topic of articles, news articles based on whether it was currency, gang, terrorism, murder, rape, smuggling, trafficking. And then I left the remaining 90% news articles that were related to crime as being crime. So the remaining 90%, which was about 300 documents, crime related, were out of those documents, 86% of the total articles labeled as crime were found to be gang and terrorism related, with 10% to be smuggling related and 4% to be currency related. Um, and this to me was interesting because the fears that India has on an open border aren't necessarily in relation to China. Yes, it does fear and portray China in its articles in a negative light, but the more worrying realization from this analysis is that most of the articles that that the Times of India are releasing on crime and news articles on crime in Nepal are around gangs and terrorism and smuggling. And as we move forward into the year, as the new election cycle comes up, a big fear could be that Modi, as an autocratic leader, looks as his open border and has prepared the media to express the open border as being a provocateur of gang and terrorism and smuggling, that this could be a very hot topic in the next election. So, in conclusion, China, in terms of being a part of the foreign policy, India's foreign policy with Nepal has begun to take a large influence within its media landscape, especially the Times of India, as that was the only newspaper that I analyzed. The Times of India portrays China in a negative light in relation to articles about Nepal, and the crime aspect of all these articles is a worrying trend that I see. The negative nature of them, the overemphasis on gang and terrorism and smuggling, that these are real issues that can cause fear in populations and begin to make Nepal an enemy. We've seen this happen with Mexico in the recent election and the open border with America. So this should definitely be something to look at in terms of what Modi is saying in the future. And so I think that looking at the Times of India as a whole, we have to understand it as in the context of an Indian newspaper trying to create an environment in which it expresses its idea of Nepal to its Indian population. And from what we can see from that is that it is presenting one certain most of its articles in a positive light, but the negative articles that it is writing could have could be used in the wrong manner in the future. Crime will be a big part of any conversation in politics and the open border with Nepal in the future. The articles really seem to point to that. And also that China's increasing influence in Nepal is worrying Indian the Times of India and potentially Modi. I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation. Hope you have a good winter break and happy holidays. Thank you.